As the world wrestles with pandemic, CPPR is committed to bring ideas from experts from various policy domains. The webinar is a part of our online series, CPPR Live Webinar Series. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished speakers, Dr. T.V. Paul and Dr. Lawrence Prabhakar, and all present here. CPPR is an independent public policy think tank based out of Kochi since 2004. We work in the focus areas of cities and infrastructure, livelihood, education, governance, election studies, international relations, defense and security. This talk is hosted by Center for Public Policy Research, Center for Strategic Studies, which deals with areas broadly encompassing international relations, India's foreign policy, defense and security. It is our great privilege for CPPR to have with us Dr. T.V. Paul. Dr. Paul is James McGill Professor of International Relations in the Department of Political Science at McGill University, Montreal, and a Fellow of Royal Society of Canada. Dr. Paul specializes in international relations, especially international security, regional security, and South Asia. Dr. Paul is author and editor of a number of books and journal articles. He has held visiting positions at various universities across the world. He is also an erudite distinguished senior fellow of CPPR. Welcome to you, sir. The moderator for this webinar is Dr. Lawrence Prabhakar. Dr. Lawrence is author, researcher, and professor of international relations and strategic studies, formerly with the Department of Political Science, Madras Christian College. Dr. Lawrence is author of a number of books, journal articles, papers. His research fellowship has been at IDSS and RSIS Nyan Technological University, Singapore, the Fulbright Fellowship at University of Michigan, and various other institutions. Welcome to you, sir. I request all the participants to mute their systems and notify us through the chat box in case you have questions. Follow the live discussion on CPPR Facebook page and also follow our live tweets with hashtag CPPR webinar. I now hand over proceedings to Dr. Lawrence. Sir.
Uh, Thank you, Mr. Ghazi Hassan and Dr. Dhanuraj for this opportunity. I thank the Lord God for this opportunity to conduct this webinar with our erudite, distinguished senior fellow, Professor T.V. Paul, who's James McGill Professor of International Relations at the Department of Political Science, McGill University in Montreal. To just briefly give a description of what the global order is before we could go into the conversation, let me introduce this topic in about 4 or 5 points by which we will commence the setting of it. The current global order is in transformation, and it has been in transformation since 2008. With the post-globalization order, we find the rise of great powers, great power play that's been going on. And at the same time, there has always been multiple orders that have been evolving in what we could call as a multiplex world that has been coming into that. It is in this context that Professor T.V. Paul's very recent book on soft balancing, restraining great powers, is one of the very important magnum opus works that has attracted much attention. And the center question here is that, is the international order a reflection of the 19th century order, or is it a variation from that? This is one question that has always been moving there. What role does international institutional frameworks play here? In what context they try to articulate the current global order? And how this global order is going to turn out are all these questions which will be in the first context. Second context will be, is conflict inevitable? If so, is great power conflict inevitable? And having gone through this trap, is a conflict inevitable between United States and China? And if so, what will be the kind of clash of the normative orders between a liberal global order and an illiberal global order? That will be the second context by which we will be looking into that. Thirdly, we look into basically what would be the respective regional strategies of the United States, China, India, Russia. What will be the balancing options of India as well as the United States, India, Russia, and the middle power coalitions, which are going to dominate the Indo-Pacific in the coming years. And thirdly, we look into what kind of global governance is going to emerge in what we could find in the Indo-Pacific in a very specific context, and also in the larger world there. And fourthly, what role does technology and strategic futures do play a role in the whole context of global order, and how do they moderate or mediate the situation is what so. It is indeed my privilege to have this conversation with Professor T.V. Paul, who is my mentor in international relations and for a long time, and I have immensely benefited from learning from him. So with that, may I open this webinar with the following question. Professor Paul, what is in your assessment is the current global order and how is it evolving? Your opinion, please.
Thank you very much for having me in this forum. This is my first engagement with you after being affiliated as a fellow, very kindly by Dhanviraj and colleagues. I think it is impressive that such an establishment is in Kochi. Usually commercial cities don't pay attention as Bombay or Mumbai shows. But I think it is a very timely initiative, and what I was also impressed by the number of topics you cover, including security and international relations, which sometimes we don't pay enough attention in South India as such, doesn't have a whole lot. So without talking much about these formalities, let me get into this conversation about order. One should distinguish between international order and world order. The international order is the older term and is still used. It involves set of rules, regulations. I mean, order by very definition is state of affairs, as you know. But in the international context, we are talking about relations, norms, principles, institutional structures, governance structures that manage interstate relations, whether it is orderly or disorderly or chaotic. So those who are interested in more theoretical sort of thing, there is literature by Hedley Bull. His book is called The Anarchical Society, calling the international system as anarchical but not chaotic. There's some kind of orderliness in it. Now, world order is a larger context, larger concept. It involves not just norms, principles, but also for justice, peace, as well as other forms of international governance structures that pay attention to improving human life. International order is a very state-centric concept. Great power-centric has been, relations among them mattered the most. But world order is a concept that progressively oriented individuals and nation states would like to evolve into. As a result, order is not just for the sake of order, but for some larger goals such as peace, justice, equality, etc. Now, talking about the current order was very much evolving since, let's say, World War II. The World War II, usually international is structured by the winning coalitions after a major war. So 1945 was the last point when such an order was structured with two large components created by the Soviet model as well as American model. So you had actually two orders present during the Cold War, although they had agreed on some parameters such as the United Nations, such as other affiliated associations, groups under UN, and a whole host of informal and formal rules about how they interact each other. But the contacts were very little. But the current order evolved after the end of the Cold War, which was Soviet collapse, communist model declined, the United States became the #1 power, with its liberal international order emerging as the victors, the Washington Consensus becoming more important. Many domains, economic, security, social, and other domains, the order evolved since the end of the Cold War, with America as the #1 power and underwriting some of the commitments, security, and economic relations. But then came the idea of globalization, or deepened globalization. Globalization has been with us for a long time. And there are social, political, economic, all sorts of dimensions to globalization, but economic dimension is most important, which is the expansion of international trade and investment among nation states and beyond, mostly carried out by multinational corporations, and that countries get involved in it, benefit from it, that sort of a borderless world where supply chains control production and distribution of materials, companies can have multiple entry points as a result. So this has been the economic component. The political component was American dominance. Institutional component was UN and a lot of other host institutions like WTO to WHO and all these institutions that provide rules and regulations. So what we are witnessing is no order is static. In human history, you had different orders, and often the orders are broken by wars among these big powers. And the post-war order is the creation of the victors, the winners. But in the end of the Cold War, and there's no clear winner there. The Americans or the Western countries tend to pretend they won the Cold War, but I don't think the Russians were defeated. They didn't concede much beyond, of course, territorial losses. But the point is, they still think they are part of the multipolar order. So the order now has become much more complex, cumbersome, as a result of globalization and some of the newer players that have become beneficiaries of globalization. And China is #1 in that. India perhaps comes down in the #2 or #3 in terms of rapid use of global economic opportunities to advance internally, in that process bringing a lot of wealth into their countries. Now, I must caution that wealth in the country doesn't mean all individuals in the country are wealthy. So yesterday I was reading Mr. Ambani is now among the top 100 billionaires. His wealth is increasing, but that doesn't mean that every Indian is benefiting from him unless you work for him in some fashion. So this is actually what I'm trying to say is that globalization as we see today has generated lots of haves and have-nots, although the have-nots have also marginally improved their lifestyles with the advance of technologies and some economic opportunity. Definitely things are, even in India, better than when I was a student in the 90s there, or 80s there. And but at the same time, there have been a division in terms of economic wealth, haves and have-nots, and billionaires are growing, whereas the poor basically working in service industry. So economic structures are affecting internally, class divisions are emerging, but the proletariat is not organized in the way it used to be during the communist era. So what's happening, other identity markers, such as religion, such as communal, such as particular philosophies, are coming out, and they are used by populist leaders, showing the displeasure toward the system. So that's the internal part. Externally, the three components of this liberal order are democratic peace, democratic states. Second, international institutions promote coordination and constraining functions. Third is democracy, international institutions, and economic interdependence. Third is interdependence. So that's sort of the Kantian, Immanuel Kant's idea of tripod of peace that could emerge. Now, there is a decline in all these areas. They are not disappeared, but they are in decline. So we are in a position where the order is challenged from various points. Then came this cataclysmic event called the COVID-19, which has affected every state, every corner, even the northernmost of Canada with frozen tundra, but still people are suffering. And we are still in progress with that crisis, depending how long it will last, how it will affect the economies, who are the winners and losers, how it will emerge out of, or the world will emerge out of it, because you cannot become secure. One country cannot solve the problem unless it completely closes its border. So we have a very dynamic, fluid situation. But the order is challenged also by the lack of leadership by the United States, which was supposed to be the hegemonic leader, liberal leader. Right now, as you know, led by a populist who says one thing today and another thing tomorrow. So we can come into that later. And I also will like to talk about China, which I'm sure is your next set of questions.
Thank you, Paul, for this a very elaborate answer. So, in your assessment, do you mean to say that the liberal international order is in relative death? Or do you think that the relative liberal international order is morphing into another variant? And do you think that the Kantian world is receding in its perception?
I just did an interview with John Eikenberry, the most important scholar on liberal international order, on his new book, which is a anthology or a discussion of 200-year-long evolution of liberal international order. So if you go to my webpage, or there is something called GrenPec, you will see that interview, and it's quite a useful one for those who want to know more about the subject. So Eikenberry is perhaps the most important scholar. He did this magnum opus, basically, going back to European Enlightenment era and modernity and evolution of liberal ideas. Liberalism has undergone multiple iterations. And one of the things that he agrees or reveals is that early liberals were heavily influenced by Enlightenment ideas of European, scientific rationality, etc. But many of them were pro-imperial orders, British, American, not American, British and French and German scholars, etc. And they were also believers of racism. So this is quite interesting dynamics. The reason being that Enlightenment cannot happen in every part of the world. Some parts are still, quote unquote, not civilized. So it is a job of the Western countries to civilize them in liberal ideas and principles. For that, colonial rule is a necessary evil. Now, of course, they will give some concessions. Racism was the order of the day. Social Darwinism, Darwin's ideas were used in the social context. And then came World War I. World War I was a pivotal moment because Woodrow Wilson, who was at the Paris Versailles conference 1919, came with the 14 points. And many people don't realize he was also an utter racist. It may sound bad. Americans will find it very hard to hear me, because now they are actually, because he withdrew a lot of concessions to Black Americans, prevented them from applying to jobs in federal government, etc. So there's a big paradox, but he's an internationalist. His ideas are internationalist. He's for self-determination, but not for the colonies, including India at that time, for the European colonies that were dismantling. So he's an utter liberal in many ways, but at the same time, he's contradictions. And this victory of Allied powers, and then this principle came into being in a League of Nations, which at that time, by the way, India attended League of Nations, was very skeptical of the League. But then came World War II. So he has a discussion of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who changed liberalism quite a bit. He was a liberal too. What he did was before the war, the Great Society, the whole welfare state was introduced, partly to prevent communism from taking over or socialist ideas from taking over. So they incorporated many ideas from socialism, Fabian socialism. You can see in all over Europe this social welfare idea, welfare state, social democracy idea coming into play, Scandinavian countries in particular. This they thought was the best way to prevent revolution within, because World War II produced a lot of class divisions and a lot of unemployed people coming in, especially GIs or army veterans. So they had to provide them some housing, etc. So Franklin D. Roosevelt played a much bigger role in making the contemporary liberal order as it is. Franklin D. Roosevelt thought that the empires were outdated ideas, the European empires, partly to make America great, by the way. We think that Americans and the Europeans were all in cahoot, yes, in some sense, but they were also playing geopolitical games. And so Roosevelt suggested to Churchill and later on that he should disband the empire and make countries and apply the self-determination that was in Woodrow Wilson's 14 points evenly to all over the world. So Roosevelt played a big role that we in India in particular don't quite remember. I guess Gandhi's role is very important, but the structural context, we have to understand that great powers had to recognize this sort of new principle. So liberalism evolved, but then the Cold War came. You have this bloc and the Western liberal idea. That's what Eikenberry's other book talks about, After Victory, how the United States created a kind of rule-bound, constitutional-like arrangement by which members would benefit, accept some level of American dominance, but it was not like a hegemonic, totally, authoritarian model. That's why it's still persisting, because NATO and other institutions, but persisting because of its cohabitation, co-equality to some extent. The order was not automatic. It had to be created. That's why you look at different components of it, the UN system in San Francisco, the Potsdam, the Yalta conferences, then the American Truman Plan, the Truman Doctrine, then you have Marshall Plan, which is very critical, providing money to European states to rebuild. And then the European Union taking, at that time, EEC, taking its own initiatives, institution structures, economic trade, etc. So this order was built around the idea that the United States will provide security, others will join as secondary players. United States will open up its huge, by the way, the US was now 50% of world economy when the World War II ended. So it had a lot of capacity to absorb. And the US would lead. So the Cold War was two structures emerging, competing. Cold War was over. Then that structure came into the new system. So the liberal order, if you look at the past 200 years, has evolved, has adapted from other systems too. And it has faced crises. So one of my questions to Eikenberry was, there's a lot of blood in the liberal hands, not as perpetrators, but as receivers. And he absolutely agreed. Liberals are not as lovey-dovey as you think. They are warriors. They're ideologues, just like our communists. They will fight if necessary to defend. And they fought a lot of unnecessary wars in liberal name. So that's the criticism of people like John Mearsheimer, who argue that the United States had no reason to get into these conflict in Vietnam or after Cold War, the Iraq wars, or really declined American power has not done much good. And so some of these are other crude realpolitik people like Rumsfeld and Cheney adopting liberal ideas, democratizing countries, etc. So luckily, liberal order is not gone. We need some form of liberal order, but the competing orders are not that great. Liberal order is standing because, as I strongly believe that humans need two kinds of things. One is freedom to express, to say what you feel, to practice your belief system, etc. Second is prosperity or economic support. Many systems will offer the second, as the Chinese do right now, but the first is missing. That's where the problem is. Whether liberalism properly applied, including the social democratic models, perhaps can do both. But liberalism corrupts itself because this is human nature. No order is beyond corruption, and sometimes there is this process by which new patterns emerge, and winners and losers emerge. And losers often get very disgruntled in the economic arena. And what we are witnessing, the populist revolution, is very much losers. I don't like that term, but what can you say in terms of distributional patterns? Are confronting this using the identity markers they know, and in the United States is race, it is class to some extent, and this is likely to be a challenge if the post-pandemic world is highly conflictual in terms of distributions and employment, etc. You'll find turbulence, but I don't think liberal order is going away, at least a large part of the world. Unless, of course, China emerges with this counter order, Tianxia or tributary order, with a lot of muscle power and economic power.
Yeah.
Sorry for giving you long answers because these are not easy topics, as you know.
No. Okay, let's make it even more concise. So, what, in your view, Professor Paul, is the notion of balancing, and how do you look into soft balancing, hard balancing, and you could also comment on smart balancing also.
Yeah, so balance of power is the cardinal approach in international order, international stability, peace. Assumes that there is no permanent peace possible because of the growth of different states during different periods. Some will become powerful, others will lose their capabilities. And when that happens, the powerful will have this incentive to conquer or dominate the powerless or less powerful. So this principle that if there is an equilibrium in power or some form of equality among powerful states, among states, there is a likelihood of peace or stability, as it is called. So this idea comes from, of course, ancient Indian, Cordial to Sun Tzu, to all talk about it a little bit. Italian city-states. But in modern times, it's the 18th century onwards. The Europeans, again connected to Enlightenment, their ideas of science and everything. And the idea was that if you get approximate or equality in parity in capabilities, then you may get peace. The Europeans practiced it. The British were the kind of balancer or force that will join back and forth different groups. In a very crude fashion, alliances were formed, counter alliances were formed with the idea to prevent war, but sometimes they led to wars. As we know, 2 world wars, there were alliances in the name of balance of power. So balance of power, at least in my the book I talk about, that I divide into 2 categories or 3 categories: hard balancing, based on 2 mechanisms: internal buildup, military buildup, and second is alignment, formal alignment among balancing states. A second is limited hard balancing, no formal alignments, but some kind of ententes or strategic partnerships, as India signed with the United States at this point. Then you have a third is soft balancing, using institutions, limited alignments, economic sanctions, etc., to restrain a threatening power or its power itself. So after the end of the Cold War, we noticed that countries were not balancing. So there is this idea of automatic balancing, which means whenever a power becomes too strong, others will join together to pull it down. And that did not happen. America was running a very powerful position for at least 2 decades. And so there was no counter coalition. And the United States entered into Iraq war without the approval of the UN Security Council. And this has generated discussion about, but other countries were doing things like vetoing within the UN or European Union disagreeing with the US. So we all thought that this is a form of new balancing in terms of restraining the power threatening behavior of the United States. So that generated that literature on soft balancing. And what we are witnessing today is countries are following multiple forms of balancing in their relationship with different countries. So take South Asia. Pakistan definitely is hard balancing with India, military buildup, arms alliance, alignment, etc. China and India toward China, I would call it a limited hard balancing. It is not building an equal number of forces, or it's not forming a proper alignment yet. It is also forming soft balancing coalitions with Japan, with Australia. The Quad is a soft balancing example. It's not a formal alignment yet. Once you have formal alignment, you are supposed to go and protect your enemy, your partner, if he is attacked. It's the automatic, Article 5 in NATO says so. That is not in any of these relationships. So countries want to retain their opportunity and flexibility. Now, is the world becoming more hard balancing? Well, China is quite an interesting case here. United States tried to restrain China with a pivot to Asia, which was a very limited hard balancing, 2,000 soldiers in Australia, and then moving 60% of the naval assets instead of 50-50 from Europe, Atlantic. But even then, it wasn't a massive buildup as you have seen during the Cold War. It is changing slowly as China is increasing its capabilities. And there is also another concept called asymmetric balancing. That's what China has been doing all this time, focusing on certain vulnerabilities, your opponent, and challenge asymmetrically. So you don't build one-on-one systems. You are having your focus on the weak points of the adversary and try to capitalize on that. And so China has shown that you can have different approaches to balancing. And other countries like ASEAN states have resorted to institutions, and that's a soft balancing. Not always succeeding, by the way. And but countries don't have a big choice, partly because economically they are so interdependent or dependent on China. I wouldn't call the word interdependence. And that when you are dependent on your primary economic partner, you cannot engage in balancing coalition against it. This is a challenge even India is facing, isn't it? So almost all of Asia Pacific now is China's number one. Their trading partner, China, is number one, may not be vice versa. And that is a Chinese clever strategy. They have used globalization. They have used elements of liberal international order, 2 critical elements, economic power as well as market access as well as international institutions. The third pillar of Kantian liberal internationalism, that is democracy, they are taking away one by one even the limited freedoms they had in Hong Kong, for instance. So the order from a balance of power point of view, it's also in flux. Right now, it is a mixture of these concepts different countries are applying. We are not in an intense hard balancing phase yet. I would argue that it is depending on the threat scenario. If the threats become existential, if India feels China is boxing in India on both the North and in the Indian Ocean, and you don't have enough capability to stand up on its own, it will need a formal alignment with the US or others. And that is depending on how China will engage. And China's behavior has not been helping in the past since Xi Jinping came to power. Smart balancing is a concept. I guess you use the best balance of power approach to gain the maximum security. I haven't been a big. I mean, it's not been theorized yet as much as the other, and there is some possibility for work there.
So having said that, what are the prospects of conflict in the Indo-Pacific? So let us shift to the Indo-Pacific. Do you envision a Thucydides trap as being promoted by Graham Allison? And if so, what are the vistas of such a Thucydides trap would emerge in the coming years?
Okay, so there are a couple of traps that have been coming out of Harvard. Graham Allison's Thucydides trap, Joseph Nye, Kindleberger trap. Those who are not familiar with it, Thucydides trap is a adapted notion from the Peloponnesian War. When Athens was growing power, the Spartans felt the need to stop that, and they started the war. That's also a controversial idea because we don't know completely whether who started the war. There are 3 or 4 wars within the Peloponnesian War. Some were started by Athens, some started by Sparta, some started by God knows. But Thucydides offers some very interesting ideas. Whenever there is a big power increase, the other parties will try to prevent that from becoming too strong. So the idea here is the United States, as it sees the Chinese emerging very powerful, may be compelled to start a war to stop that from happening, unseating it by the Chinese. Kindleberger trap is the idea that the countries need a hegemonic power to provide them collective security as well as economic security. And during the 1930s, when the world was in Great Depression and turmoil, there was no leadership coming from powerful states such as the United States. And so the idea is that if the world is probably similar to that to some extent today, you need proper leadership. Otherwise, international order will go into a tailspin and different kind of conflict will emerge. Coming to Indo-Pacific, by the way, is a concept that is a very military-oriented concept. It's a concept that India likes, and the US Navy likes it too. And the Chinese don't like it much. I know that from personal interactions with them. But they are part of the problem. The moment you have BRI, moment you have the spread of Chinese Navy into Indian Ocean and beyond, Indian Ocean becomes part of this strategic concept, and the Indo-Pacific has its value. In fact, the world during the colonial period was Indo-Pacific. Indian Ocean was the hub of much of the European activity and colonial wars. Of course, they spread to East Asian waters later, Southeast Asia, etc. So it's a return of the patterns, and then of course you have the Silk Roads that the Chinese now are building too on different dimensions. Will Thucydides trap happen? I don't see it's happening in a direct big war, partly because of nuclear weapons, and it could escalate very rapidly. And what could happen is limited crises and limited wars, such as the Taiwan Strait or the East China area or the Japan Sea, or even in the Indian Ocean area, the Straits of Malacca, etc. And so the Chinese strategy is sort of, as we all know, salami slicing, or 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, is exactly what they're doing on the northern border right now with India, Ladakh. You gain something at the end. And I was rereading Sun Tzu the other day. before going to bed, and my wife said, "What are you reading? Why are you reading about war right now?" I'm very confused. Instead of reading some peaceful things, you're reading about Sun Tzu. I said, I just want to see if these guys are following Sun Tzu's ideas in the Indo-Indian conflict today. And it is exactly the lines there that say, when your enemy is weak, strike. It is quite an interesting. So there are quite a few paragraphs that you can replan and put in the Chinese grand strategy today. And also Mao's ideas, by the way. Mao was influenced by Sun Tzu, big way. So I don't know whether they will get there. Now, coming back to the US has a challenge. US has also some benefits, by the way. The US is, you may say it's down now with all this COVID and all that. US has the best universities in the world, best thinkers, ideas. I was in that system, and it really educates. And what Mr. Trump did was such a mindless understanding of it. Educating the world, including Kamala Harris's mother, helped the United States to build its technological momentum in Silicon Valley, etc. The US can bounce back with the proper leadership. US may have social revolution happening because they have such racism still in the systemic manner. Distributional problems are so much problematic. But the US will be a very powerful state for at least some more decades. It may relatively decline, and the Chinese will come up because of the sheer size, population, and determination. By the way, this is what is missing in India. I am sorry to say, India has everything going except a national determination among different components of the Indian state and Indian people. It's not one leader talking about great India. It's also the village officer in your, or the municipality fellow. Is he getting the idea that my work is important for making India great? The Chinese Communist Party has told everybody that you are working for making China great power in the 21st century. Anyway, this is a topic that I'm trying to write about, but not an easy one. So, will there be a war? That's almost like saying, will I get a Nobel Prize one day? All kinds of possibilities exist. War is prevented by a number of facts. And you had one question about the differences between the European era and today. The European states were congested states in a land they needed to conquer to become powerful. Territory was very important, direct territorial conquest, because among the factors of production, land was very important. What are the differences today? In fact, you don't need a lot of land. You can be a Hong Kong, a Singapore, just keep building up and up, become a very rich country without having too much land. And so then the other factor is conquest doesn't necessarily make you rich, or you could lose even if you win. Look where the British Empire was and where it is today. It won World War II, actually both wars. It won a lot of wars. This is a challenge. War is not going to bring you what you need. So sometimes wars start because of stupid leaders thinking that they can advance quickly. And that is also prevented by the fact that the nuclear factor makes it quick victories, short war illusions, all problematic. Then the other factor is whether people are worried about what the other side is doing. This is where not many people talk about it, which is this intelligence capacity to gather information. World War I was started, one fellow reporting from the front, the Germans are mobilizing. Today, your technology, your remote sensing would tell you whether they are mobilizing or not. They may have amassed troops, but if they are only there for defensive deterrent purposes, it doesn't matter whether they have troops there or not. I mean, I can see that in the India-China context too. Intelligence has become a lot better. Those who serve in military knows that intelligence matters a lot. It's not human intelligence, it is technical and scientific. That change is big. This determination to jump the moment you get a little news that, you know, that the 1914 was the timetable war. Get there before the guy gets, who will start the war first? Because if you don't strike first, you will lose. That world has changed a lot. The second is, of course, globalization. Globalization is very different from 1900s. Of course, Britain and Germany were globalized. But today you have multiple levels of globalization: economic, social, political, migration. And the economic globalization itself is not just trade, it's also investment, it's also platforms, different production facilities. And so if Chinese economy goes down, it can affect everybody else. So you have a stake in creating, not to create radical shifts in economic relationships. So there are a number of them normatively too. Of course, nobody is interested in war, but wars can happen inadvertently. As we all know in history, escalatory ladder can go up even in nuclear context. So you need some leadership and statesmanship, prudence, and that is missing all over the world. You can't find a single leader whom you can say, this guy is going to lead us to paradise. So we need to think about crisis, and then crisis as opportunity, crisis as adaptation facility, and how leadership will emerge out of it. I'm not completely pessimistic, cautiously optimistic, because we have better instruments today, technological, political, institutional, to prevent escalation to the level of Thucydides' trap.
Having said that, how do you construe domestic order and governance and grand strategy of great powers in the Indo-Pacific? Do you see a link between these, and how do they work out and play out in this present context?
Yeah, there's always been a relationship between grand strategy and domestic politics, domestic capacity too. So what is happening in the case of China, its grand strategy is very much tied to the Communist Party's survival. And now it realized that becoming a global power is a very catchy thing, and that domestic legitimacy of the party can stay in power if they provide two things: one, economic prosperity; second, international status. Status is like a socio-political, psychological concept. You want to be respected by others, as well as you have certain institutional hierarchical positioning. So this ambition that Xi Jinping has proposed, replacing the United States, is a great motto of, past too. Germany tried to do that, Japan tried to do that. But they all try to do that very quickly with capacity that they thought can make the enemy lose. Limited wars in conflict areas for Japan, but then it escalated beyond their dreams and it became a world war. So grand strategy of United States too has been affected by its domestic politics, although one can see a kind of consistency or follow through by different regimes, different groups on some core issues. The Cold War, there was a consensus. Today, that consensus is missing to some extent, unless China becomes a threat or Russia becomes a threat. And because Mr. Trump's approach towards these things are ad hoc, personalized, and populist. Part of it is ideological, part of it is sheer ignorance, to be very frank. The man hasn't read anything. A leader has to be knowledgeable. He's one of these crude businessmen who's interested in making money, but he is surrounded by a bunch of people who are also like that. But overall, America's greatness is also that it has institutional structure. The Pentagon, for instance, has been very careful. You notice they don't follow everything Trump does or says. So these structures are surviving, and it will. And so domestic politics matters, but there is a two-way relationship. The Chinese become aggressive for domestic regime security. That affects the other countries' relations. The others will develop different grand strategies. Grand strategy is also sometimes personal ambitions of the leader. It's very clear that Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping are different in that sense. Although Deng said, sit until you can stand. So there is idea of standing is still possible at some point. Whereas Xi Jinping is in a hurry. This is the most dangerous combination. People are in a hurry. They want to achieve all this in their lifetime to go down in history as that rebuild the Chinese empire. The other danger is, as I see, is the civilizational state, the use by these populist leaders to bring back some old empire. The Chinese somehow think that they can rule Asia Pacific through a Tianxia system or this tributary model. Everybody kowtow to the Chinese emperor, the son of God or whatever it's called. As long as you don't challenge the hegemony, you're secure. If you challenge, we will punish you. So that is part of the challenge of Asia. I mean, bringing back the old question, BRI is partially led by that notion that you become dependent on us, but you don't lose your complete sovereignty. So the Sri Lankans will have some sovereignty, but they will also have to agree with us, you know. Now the only countries that are reluctant to do that are India and Japan. And so what is happening in the border is partly to prevent India from taking independent positions or building its own infrastructure or joining the US coalition, etc. But on the other hand, he's playing his hands unnecessarily escalating. Yesterday I was with this Chinese group in Beijing and I told them rather bluntly that you don't have to do anything. You will become a superpower within the next 20 years. As Germany was going to become. It's the Kaiser who dismissed Bismarck, who said prudence is important, just stay on. Because the moment he controls 50% of the world economy, there is no way China is irrelevant, okay? You become part of the Chinese tributary model de facto, whatever, or default, by default. But if you make everybody insecure in your neighborhood and you don't have too many friends, by the way, coercion is not the way to get friends, as we know. This was a great thing about America. You know, they use coercion, but there is also ingratiation. You graduate student, you bring in and he or she gets the best education, and then you have sympathy to American model because it allowed you that. And you are an Indian, Pakistani, Chinese, whatever, you can come and live with us and become an American. The Chinese don't do that. Fortunately, India doesn't do that either. That is part of the American attraction, the liberal attraction. Despite all its problems, it offers opportunities irrespective of your origins or your color. Or I'm not saying it's perfect, by the way. If you are not born in, I mean, the blacks are a great example of people who don't, systemic racism is still there, but we Indians in general have done very well in that system. So in general means most, not all. So this is the problem, that this order that is evolving in different components, the Chinese model, for instance, may be attractive to some, but I don't see any country jumping into the bandwagon and joining a line. Even Pakistan, you know, we don't know how much that relationship is. Nobody wants to be a dependent of others. That is what is likely to happen if China continues the way it is.
Coming to rounding off this discussion, what do you think would be the global commons approach in the Indo-Pacific, and what are the contexts of global governance and how that will stabilize the Indo-Pacific of the various competitive and convergent issues as well as cooperative issues?
Yeah, so global commons are all those issues where there is no excludability, which is public goods. There's different concepts in public choice theory, economics. So air we breathe, the environment, Arctic, Antarctic, the deep sea, the outer space, all these are humanity's common heritage. So management of those global commons has been given to international institutions, international regimes, evolving numbers in different areas, including environment today. And this is where also the challenge is happening, because take the case of the oceans. The Chinese have worked around some of the components of the law of the sea. They haven't signed on to it. Same with the US. But they are really upsetting that law of the sea, sort of to some extent, by saying that we don't consider the 200-mile zone, maritime zone, from to penetrate, to go and do fishing, for instance. So they are, at the same time, they will like to have, if they develop these islets in South China Sea, they like to have their 200-mile or even beyond. So there is a primitive understanding of that global commons. My worry, they may try to do something like that in Indian Ocean. And I think India should declare this is our ocean. I don't think that'll be easy, because Indian Ocean doesn't have that many these islets you can rebuild unless you decide to block the Sri Lanka, India, the Park Strait, and make it sometimes the tide comes, unless then, there are ways to do that. Of course, Andaman is a great place to do things, so Malacca Straits. Now, whether we will get a global regime for the law of the sea is perhaps the way to go, and create a governing structure for that. I don't think there is a proper governing structure. We had one outer space that's being whittled down. Antarctic and Arctic we have, that's also being affected to some extent. But global governance is absolutely necessary. Institutional structures are necessary. And crises, right now, WHO and WTO are two institutions that have been providing some of these public goods, are under threat. But I think they have to be there. Something has to be there. There has to be an International Civil Aviation Organization, or IATA too, to control global air traffic. Otherwise, you have to get permission from Pakistan every time a flight goes through its airspace. And this is very cumbersome. Countries realize it doesn't work. So these regimes and these institutions are created to manage these global commons issues, make them efficient as well as practical. And now sometimes some countries led by populists or leaders think that they don't need global governance. And global governance has this socialist idea attached, partly because every state is equal in sovereign equality terms. But governance structures are there in every domain. International order or world order is built around governance structure too. And so what we are witnessing is confusion created by certain leaders in certain countries, selective use of institutional structures, and also, as you mentioned, the technological revolutions, the rapid technological revolutions, whether that will lead to competition in outer space, competition in terms of artificial intelligence, cyber, etc. All these are up in the air and would require rapid thinking if somebody gains too much advantage. And then, of course, making them universally available for countries to gain access, to prevent global issues such as pandemics, or to manage crisis if there is major catastrophe in terms of ecological crisis, or to prevent wars and conflicts, Thucydides traps. So this requires some statesmanship, leadership, prudence, and cooperation among countries. And as I said, that is missing today because we are unlucky to have certain types of leaders who don't believe in science, who don't believe in cause and effect, who also think that ideas like race, religion, political religion, or ethnic dominance can bring back glory. They rarely bring back glory, honestly. But it can be used by regimes for their security. But I would conclude by saying that despite its weaknesses, we need better liberalism, improving liberal ideas. That include freedom, that includes secular ideas. Humanity, people are equal, men or women, gender parity, opportunity for people. We need to think of how to improve our conditions, those who are suffering. So hierarchical modes, whether the Chinese or the Indian ways of thinking or the American way of race, caste, etc., have done enormous damage to people because of these systemically brought ideas don't change. So social movements are developing, but time is to take the action by leaders and communities, shows that our next generation will not suffer what previous generation did, whether it is war, whether it is racism, whether it is casteism, whether it is communalism, whether it is religious intolerance, whatnot.
Okay, that was a good conversation. So may I open up the this webinar for questions, and as instructed by the hosts, I will ask you to raise these questions either in the chat box or in any way by which you could address the speaker. Please go ahead. Sharveshwara Prasad has asked, how can India maintain its cordial relations between US and Russia simultaneously without compromising a bit of our interest? That's one question is asked. Second question, will India sign the NPT anytime soon?
Who will sign?
India.
No.
And then the third question is, what are your ideas of preparing the people of our country for the global knowledge economy? This is by Mr. Sharveshwara Prasad.
Okay. I can't remember all the questions. If you keep repeating them, you'll have to repeat in a few seconds.
Okay.
Let's take the first two. First one was
NPT.
what?
What about NPT? Will India sign NPT?
India doesn't have to sign NPT. It's already a de facto NPT member. If it signs NPT, NPT will have to amend. And NPT is as extended in perpetuity, it is not amendable easily. Okay, it can be amended. And if you amend it, it would mean all these countries that tested weapons will have to be incorporated in some fashion. So I don't think the non-nuclear states are willing to do that. India is getting the best benefit with that nuclear deal Manmohan Singh signed with Bush. And so don't talk about NPT anymore. It's irrelevant for India.
The other question is about India's balanced relationship between United States and Russia.
It won't be easy unless, of course, India can convince US, hopefully the next administration too, that Russia is an important partner to stabilize, to make China not to become too strong. So if China, Russia become an alignment, it's bad for US and India. It's not always easy because this is a status competition. The Russians want more respect, more equal treatment. The Americans are unwilling to give that. So it will be a balancing act. But if China and Russia forms a military alignment, which is unlikely, India will have no choice but to abandon that, because India then will have to join the US alignment. So if it's a Cold War, like previous eras, bipolar order, it will be hard to maintain non-alignment in the emerging order. India wants to be a player. India is no longer subaltern, okay? India was a weak state during the Cold War. So that is why India has to play this according to the evolving situations.
Yeah, then Ms. Vandana Gopi has asked a question, how will China's rise affect the Indian economy?
I blame quite a bit India, honestly. I'm not trying to be an NRI sitting here and judging. India had all the opportunities the globalization offered it, just like China. India did well in pharmaceuticals and IT to some extent, that too software areas. But the industrialists and all, there was a moment of great possibilities. And what is lacking in developing that? Take infrastructure. I never understood why India has not put the emphasis on infrastructure. Some of us who have been to China, you watch all the videos you have, they have overtaken Western countries in infrastructure. Now, India can do that. Of course, there are constraints. They'll say immediately say there are constraints. It's a different country. No. It is a mindset. He's a PW bureaucrat doing his job, or he's into corruption, collecting money. There's a lot of mental, the mindset has to change. Second is education. Why is it so hard to spend at least 6% of the GDP, minimum required for building your capacity and providing a globally good educational system? And this whole poverty situation, I mean, these handouts are okay, but it's not enough. You need to educate people to get them productive citizens. And so India has opportunities, but some are self-inflicted wounds, lack of a proper planned system, proper infrastructure system, educational system. Our attention is into now issues that will divide us. And that is the problem too. Can we think of a unified understanding of great India will become only through capacity building and distribution of this, one of the most unequal societies in the world because of systemic factors? How can we build up this great demographic dividend? And that dividend should involve the Dalit, the poor, the marginalized, women, whatnot. If you're not bringing them up, India will never become a great power because you're talking about a large segment of the population suffering, and that's not how a great power should be.
The other questions by Dr. Vijay Shakuja. While Indo-Pacific has gained popularity among the Asian countries, except China, the US is highly focused in the Western Pacific, represented by the Pacific Surge, targeted against China. Will the current US-China contestation, which is not coming to an end in the near future, force the US to put back on the back burner the Indian Ocean for a while, notwithstanding Iran and Persian Gulf or the Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean? That's the first question he's asked. There's one more question is there.
Yeah, so this again is depending on where the threats to its core allies are focused. So Japan is its core ally. Taiwan is also core ally. Australia, all these. And American power is very much based on its Pacific power. It's a Pacific great power too, Pacific backwaters. So as long as the Chinese haven't entered the Indian Ocean in a big way, Chinese are slowly entering, partly because of American missteps in alienating Iran, I think was a big mistake. But there is sufficient capacity in some of these Gulf countries as well as in the Diego-Garcia area. I think America's main focus will be how to protect Japan, how to protect Taiwan, and Southeast Asia up to a point. Now, Indian Ocean is much more important today than it used to be. That's why we have Indo-Pacific, and the command structures, as you all know, have been reformulated up to a point. If the Chinese build several military bases or convert their trading posts, and the Americans will have to pay attention in Indian Ocean. And in a way, it is a calm before storm situation, and we don't know how far China would go. China has been very careful not to militarize BRI as East India companies, unlike the East India companies. So that may not last long because they need protection to their huge trading networks. And if there are crises or choke points, as we discussed, in Malacca Straits, this would be an incentive for developing the different corridors, or cutting the Thai corridor they're talking about, Burma, Thai, Myanmar areas. The United States also has got its priorities, and I think the US is thinking, obviously, in a big way on Indian Ocean. It will depend on how the Chinese play. So it's reactive at this point, as far as I see, not that proactive. It will be very interesting, the US-India relationship, the Quad, how that will evolve, whether it will become a military alliance or not, and how India becomes a strong naval power. If India has a good navy, United States can outsource it, or other countries can. It can provide collective goods, common goods, which others don't. So I think emphasis on navy is important. Usable naval power. It is not the big aircraft carrier. It's also those small ones that can withstand conflict, as naval experts know that. Aircraft carriers can be sitting ducks in some situations. But the big ones are needed for status purposes, as we know, conspicuous consumption it's called. And we don't know exactly how the situation emerges. China is ambitious, but China can also be prudent. China is testing the waters in many ways. And America is also sometimes distracted with various things. So threat environment is important. Who will become threat, where the threat will come, and that will determine the military positioning, at least to my point of view.
The other question that is about artificial intelligence, big data, and the technological order that is in ascendancy, which the US has been able to make it. How do you think the vistas between US and China will be played out, given the continued favorable balance of military power with the United States?
That's a big question. And to begin with, why isn't India building artificial intelligence strongly? I mean, it will have civilian and military applications. My reading, by the way, I'm not a big expert on it, but my reading is that the Chinese are building certain kind of artificial intelligence. I heard swarming soldiers and all kinds of things. But artificial intelligence has got a role to play in the emerging warfare situation. So does human intelligence. And we know that drones work, but humans have to manage them to some extent. And artificial intelligence, we also know that there could be defensive and deterrent systems too. So this competition for artificial intelligence systems, if offense gains dominance, as we know, aircraft and tanks allowed the blitzkrieg strategy for the Germans, quick war, short war. If an artificial intelligence system allows such a scenario, then a rising power or a threatening state could think of war as a way to overcome. And also the artificial intelligence has to overcome the nuclear dilemma, the problem of nuclear weapons. All these suggest that warfare will be complex, as we know, and we need to think of more of tailored deterrence, tailored defense, tailored offense. But all you need is big breakthrough that gives one side, especially if it's an expansionist power, overwhelming power. And at the moment, the Chinese are working on it, but I don't think they are going to get there any easily. The United States also may have advantages over time. But I do think that India has to position in all these areas its own capabilities, collaboration sometimes. If you want to avoid dominance by others, you don't need another freedom struggle, by the way. You may not get a Gandhi to do that.
I think Mr. Thomas wants to know, why did liberalism and liberal order, despite its humanitarian and development content, fail to emerge as a major political force or establishment in countries which were citadels of liberal thought?
I didn't quite understand that there was a disruption.
Why was liberalism a failure as a major political force in Europe, even though Europe has been a citadel of liberal thoughts?
It depends what you mean by failure. Some elements of it are failures, the Kantian idea of the final phase. But you read the Immanuel Kant's famous book, The Perpetual Peace, liberalism or liberal mode will not be easy. There will be wars, there will be conquests, there will be defeats, there will be adaptations. And eventually you get a system whereby your stranger will be accepted as one like you. A visitor will be one like you. These Kantian ideas are quite fascinating that way. But I would not call liberalism a failure. A failure is when it's completely collapsed, everybody gives it up. It is going through considerable trials and tribulations. For instance, the democratic deficit you see in many countries, and also the populist rise, economic dislocations. Some of it is beyond liberalisms or any isms. Cannot forecast a COVID coming in. The COVID is an unprecedented attack on anybody, any model. And the financial crisis. So one thing the liberals did wrongly this time in the past 10, 20 years, or during the post-Cold War period, was giving this neoliberal idea too much prominence. By the way, neoliberalism is only one aspect of liberalism, which is laissez-faire, free trade, let the market decide. Adam Smith kind of idea, then Washington consensus. But there is other liberal ideas there, which include the welfare state, social democracy, income in distribution, etc. And you find different periods, liberal ideas changing from time to time. So my reading is, among all the systems capable of adapting to the 21st century, considering that people want freedom, people want equality, people want opportunity, that is liberalism. I'm not saying the Western or American models at this point, but it needs to be seen as an adaptable system. It can evolve. In between, it makes a lot of mistakes, which is why you ended up in these unnecessary wars and human suffering in the Middle East, for instance. And so I would not call liberalism fail. Liberalism fails when America completely gone, Europe completely defeated, China takes over the world, or populists completely controlled. So a lot of these conditions have to emerge. I mean, Mr. Biden could win in return, bring back some of the liberal ideas, evolve it differently. And by the way, populists haven't done very well. Look at the Brazilian guy, or Britain, or Russia. You find that, or America, okay, I should include. What is their performance in dealing with this COVID crisis? I think we have to look at the alternative models that are providing social benefits and their inability to do anything because they are not science-based or evidence-based. I don't want to talk about India because I know it's a very tough spot right now. But there is a bit of populism in India too, which is not proving to be able to produce results as we want. So I think populism is antithesis of, or hurting liberalism, using liberal electoral idea to gain power and then doing what you want. My humble opinion is all these populists will fail. Some will survive using markers like religion or class distinctions. Populism is a reaction to inequalities generated by social production, or a gifted leader with oratory capacity managing to invoke civilization or culture or religion or whatever. But they don't necessarily offer collective good for everybody. And their record is unlikely to be that great when you look back. What did they achieve? They need a good strategy to do better. And populists who don't rely on cost benefit analysis, scientific principles cannot do that. It cannot be whimsical. It cannot be, I got a dream when I was sleeping and therefore I make choices. It's not a good way to rule a country or anybody. So liberalism is not gone. It is facing a challenge, substantial challenge, and it needs adaptation and improvement.
Yeah, I think there are some common questions, Professor Paul. I'll just go through it quickly, and some of which people want me to respond also. So the one aspect is about the relevance of Quad, how far Quad is a workable concept. If you can please note it, and then I think in the interest of time, we could optimize it. How do you feel that Quad is a workable concept? It's asked by Vice Admiral Muralidharan, and to what extent it can put pressure on China in the maritime front. That's one question. Second question is basically about how an ambitious China could lead to an Asia-centric Cold War. Is that a possibility? Professor Abraham is asking that. And the other question is by Vanisri, who is asking, what do you think about India's position in the changing global order and regional organizations? What is going to be India's future in that? Then there are two more questions. What is the global order? How does the global order change with after the COVID-19? How does it work it out? Is one more question. And then what will be the strategic collaboration between the Russia, India, China triangle? Will that be an alternative? So these are some questions I want you to.
How much time we have? How much time we have left?
That's what I want to know. I think it's about 7:25 time in India. So, Ghazi, how long could we go? Because I have a lot of questions here, and
Sir, we can go on, sir. We have questions. We can go on, sir.
yeah, because I think there are questions asked to me as well as to Professor Paul and to collectively to both. I'm seeing the chat box is getting filled up here. So, if
my suggestion is not more than 10-15 minutes max, because people will get bored. I don't know, they are enjoying this. If they are, fine, but
yeah,
we
there are
conclude that.
I think if you can take this
we
question,
can go till 7:45.
yeah, another 15 minutes we can go.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Good. So you want me to answer them first, or you will go?
Yeah, you answer it. Then in the part of the conclusion, then I'll sum it up the whole lot of it.
The Quad workable or not?
Yeah.
It depends.
Yes.
At this point, I don't see the Quad is more than a soft balancing coalition, because Quad would, to become a hard balancing coalition, there will be military coordination, there will be operational coordination, force integration, doctrinal integration, and a series of steps that will make it an alliance, military alliance, like NATO, or even may not be that strong, but there are bilateral alliances too. And I don't know whether India is ready for that, or even Japan is ready for that, Australia. So the ball is in the Chinese court. The Chinese become extremely threatening on the Himalayan side as well as Indian Ocean, India, and all this, and of course East Asia. The Chinese are pushing around Japan at this point. That may provoke a balancing coalition. And if there is, for instance, Russia-China alliance, which I think is very unlikely, Russians also want to be treated as a powerful state, not as a chela of China, by the way. There is tension in there, which we often don't hear. So Quad will be evolving. as the threat evolving, threat environment evolving, it may take different forms. It could also become a semi-alliance, quasi-alliance. How is ambitious China? Yeah, China is pursuing a very clever strategy. It had a period of massive growth. And it also depends if the post-COVID world Chinese economy will pick up momentum and everybody else will go down. China becomes, let's say, 50% of world economy, as US was after World War II. China will be very powerful. You cannot, and the Chinese currency, Chinese investment mode, Chinese technology, just like America was. That's why the BRI is an arm of that Chinese ambition. They know that the West may not be there all the time. They need new trading places, new countries, Africa, Asia, Latin America, as sellers and buyers of goods and producers of the resources they need. So a Sinic-centered Tianxia system with modification is very possible, partly because the Chinese are the only one building infrastructure in these countries. Chinese are giving them some money and development. The Western countries are not. Even India is not, for Africa, for instance. But the Chinese order has to be careful. These countries are also nationalistic. So even the small Maldives could turn around if they realize that China is pushing too hard. This is where a country like India has to play its role to make sure these smaller states don't become total appendages of China, vassals of China. So Sri Lanka, engagement is necessary to make sure no Chinese military vessel is parked in Hambantota, that they don't allow these sort of things. Same with Bangladesh, same with Myanmar. And I'm unhappy from a strategic point of view, India is losing that Chabahar thing. It would have been very useful for India. So diplomacy should be with these smaller states. It is not in your interest to be part of great power conflict beyond a point. You may think that, like Nepal today, by making these bold statements, you gain something from one side, but you want to preserve your sovereignty, equality. So India has to offer them something more than what China is offering: respect and diplomacy and some development alternatives. I think the Chinese may gain some foothold in very weak states, but nationalism is very powerful, self-determination in the post-colonial world. So I won't worry too much about it, but the Chinese economic juggernaut is not going to be stopped. They are very determined. They have technocratic leadership, and now universities and infrastructure companies, state-run development, and a kind of an ideology that is, it's not that communist anymore, but it is also authoritarian. So there are a lot of possibilities China could become very dominant state. But India is considered as a swing state that could determine the balance of power in Asia Pacific if it plays its cards well. In order to do that, India has to become an economic counterweight to China, place where they can come and sell goods. India can become another big part of Asia Pacific's economic order, which India was. I'm talking about the India of 17th, 18th century, when 24% of the world economy was in India, or South Asia general. 26% in China, by the way. We all think that. Mughal Empire was apparently very rich. A lot of famines and poverty, but the point is, there's a lot of richness in India. I mean, we all know in Thiruvananthapuram, if that gold is taken out of Sri Padmanabha's, temple, that could make Kerala as powerful as I was told Austria at this point. Anyway, it's a very sentimental topic for some of you, but I don't understand. God will not punish for providing some alms to the poor. That apart, let's come back to this China question. The Chinese have to play this very carefully. They could also lose it getting into wars and conflicts. They are not loved by many today. I'm not talking about the average Chinese, but the country as such, because of certain missteps. I don't understand why they needed to needle countries when this virus crisis is going on. It may have some Sun Tzu element in it, but it's also a mistake to lose. People remember these humiliations. They remember, by the way, humiliations inflicted on them by the Western countries and Japanese and all that. Now, they think that others won't remember the humiliation they're going to inflict. India hasn't forgotten 62 yet. So this lack of understanding of reciprocity and possibility that others will have is a problem. So let's hope China will change, a benign power, but at the same time very important state. And I do see a kind of by multipolar order, bipolarity with the US-China for a period of time, a multipolarity in economic arena, at least with India and Japan to some extent. But it will be a very complex system which needs management order, will require a lot of adjustments by countries. In order for it to play any big role, money is important, wealth is important, infrastructure is important, and the looks of the country. You visit Bihar, you think you are in sub-Saharan Africa. That must change. That can be changed through infrastructure. That can be changed through proper developmental patterns. And this is a policy engineering. And this is where we need to put our emphasis. Become a China in terms of internal development, not losing democracy part. That is the virtue of this country. You cannot become a China because they have a lot of different attributes that India is different, multicultural, multi-ethnic. So democracies do progress, by the way. It's a myth that you need to be an authoritarian state to progress. Just look around your neighborhood. What happened to all the authoritarian states? Whatever India did, despite being a democracy, is what we need to think of. How to strengthen a democratic order at the same time an economic power, superpower. I think things can happen. How does, well, the triangle, I don't see it emerging in terms of India values Russia up to a point, but Russia is also very hang on this equalizing status with the West, partly because the West has treated them very poorly after the end of the Cold War. And Russian nationalism is also built around this old idea we can come back as a great power, a superpower. So they are missing demographic strength. They have some technology. They have strong leadership. They have diplomacy. So it will be a player, but unless you have a popular base, and economies cannot be built without the demographic strength, as we know. And so it is a period where these powers are becoming important. India's future in the global order, I kind of worry if we don't play this game carefully. India may be attractive to some of the powers episodically, but you look at the deep relationships, deep respect comes to those who show they can achieve things economically, socially, politically, and other things. That's why hugging is not enough. You need to have that trade with you, the commercial aspect with you, the technological aspect with you, to be attractive power. And attractiveness comes from not just wealth, but it's also your political order, a system. If it is intolerant, if it is producing a lot of internal violence and unhappy people, who wants to embrace a country? And so we have to think about what order we want to. So this internal, external connectivity is very important. Connection is very important.
Okay, so let's sum up this webinar. First and foremost, I would like to thank profusely Professor T.V. Paul for a very patient, meticulous the very erudite answering of all these, the presentation of questions and the answering, and also sharing these different perspectives. On 4 points, I would like to conclude in what Professor Paul said. That will be the concluding remarks. On the nature of the changing order in the Indo-Pacific, we find that there are 3 variations that are likely to come. First and foremost, it will be what is called as a period of transition. What has not been, basically we have looked into it, is the US element to come back. And that is where the Pacific Deterrence Initiative is coming in full force. In as much as in 2014, there was an European Deterrence Initiative against Russia. United States is mounting what is called the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, which is coming back in full force, which is going to play in terms of how the Chinese island chain strategies are going to be contained there. And that is going to be predicated on a technological supremacy that the United States will exercise. And that is where we'll find that many of these changes are going to come in the hub and spokes arrangement that the United States had since the 1960s with Japan, Australia, and South Korea there. So that transition is going to come in a bigger way. And I think China has been Bismarckian in many of those concepts. It has been in a hurry to assert its power. And that's the reason why, as what Dr. Nandakishore has asked in terms of sharp power, the Chinese sharp power, the endurance of the Chinese sharp power is brief. What China lacks is a kind of a depth in terms of strategic depth, in terms of an independence of its resources. China still depends upon the global sea lanes of communication for import of its raw materials. And that is a place where we will find that Quad, if it becomes a hard power balancing option, China will be put into a checkmate gambit by the United States as well as Japan and that of India and that of the other countries there. The second factor of the changing order is the role of the middle powers. The role of the middle powers is very important in as much as the great powers, because the role of Japan, Australia, Korea, and India are vital, because we cannot write them off as of that. And that again depends upon how much of the internal orders, domestic orders, are there in China, India, United States, and Russia there. China at the present faces an extreme regime insecurity. The CCCP has come into a very strong opprobrium from within its population there. It is one thing to assess Chinese capabilities in the external sense, but without having domestic legitimacy, as what Professor Paul mentioned, you will find that China has what I would call clay feet, and it will not be able to stand into that. So you will find an episodic change coming into China, like how it happened in 1948. A lesser authoritarian version would probably emerge into that. And Xi Jinping's legacy is already over, because he's pushing too hard, both in terms with India, which is totally unprovoked, in terms of Hong Kong, and in terms of Taiwan, has actually brought about a reaction system that is there. Therefore, the change in global order is not going to be a very neat transition. It is going to be a little nasty. At the same time, there is also an illiberal order that has been emerging in this part of the world, especially in China and Russia. And this illiberal order does not augur very well for the greater good of the global order. So that is not going to strengthen the international institutions, because international institutions that have been crafted too long with a liberal ideology has been a mainstay of stability in the global order. So that is a source of concern that could come into that. The second aspect that I want to mention here is in terms of how other states are playing a very important role, specifically in terms of new regionalism. New regionalism is a new mantra that has been worked out, and we find the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership of China, and the rebooted Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is coming from the United States, and the other 11 countries are there. I think in the post-COVID era, I think the distrust or the trust deficit towards China will actually make the countries move away from the RCEP, and they would like to have a retooling of the CTPP, which is the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which will have its own lifetime to come back into that. Professor Paul did mention about the US pivot. The US pivot and the Obama administration was a half-hearted attempt. But what we find in the present administration, no matter how much of criticism can be given, is a deterministic push of the Pacific Deterrence Initiative that has actually turned the Chinese away from the what you could call the Western Pacific, and that's one reason why the Chinese are forced to concentrate on the Indian theater, and therefore I think India will be in a position to give an appropriate response in the coming days, because this particular Sun Tzu art of war is not going to be played in an era of technological uncertainty there. This is one point that I would like to mention here. The other point is basically in terms of the role of Canada. What is the role of Canada? I think that I will ask Professor Paul to basically mention, because Canada is America's northern neighbor. To what extent that coordination will come is a question that could be asked into it. And there's one more question that has been basically asked is in terms of whether scientific technological intelligence will prove to be the harbinger of change. Certainly it would come into that, and but much of that is not going to sustain in terms of the kind of uncertainty that we are facing today, because we find the issues of 5G, the issues of artificial intelligence. These are actually the disruptive changes besides the COVID, and therefore they constitute a very hazy global order, vistas of a global order, and the Indo-Pacific itself is now a much churned water, and therefore the much churned Indo-Pacific will take considerable time before things cool down. And as far as the United States is concerned, I consider the US to be the harbinger of the Indo-Pacific security for years to come. And with these words, let me conclude my comments. And if Professor Paul would like to respond to the question on Canada, that will be good, actually.
Yeah, I'll make it very brief. I think we are very close to our concluding minutes. Canada is a middle power in some areas, benefiting from the mistakes America is making in the Silicon Valley. They are not giving H-1 visas. Canada is opening up for technical people to migrate. Canada is attracting also a lot of students from India included, because America is not. And this transition from student to migrant is something that Canada has been very smartly doing. And so it's attracting both talent and capital. A lot of people from Gulf countries are coming and buying properties and settling down in places like Toronto and making the real estate very, very expensive. Canada has a lot of potential for growth in terms of human capital, technological capital, and a democratic country, which is, I mean, it has some corruption problems occasionally, but it tends to elect people who are middle of the road and tend to do some development. It has problems in some areas, and it's affected by the challenges coming from the Trump administration and China today, by the way. Canada has taken some positions. The Chinese are not happy. So Canada will be part of the Western Alliance, if there is one. But Canada is also trying to create its own path. And G20 was one of the things Canada was hoping to build upon. Where Canada will be, Canada is potentially be a nice country and will stay like that and secure quite a bit in terms of geographical security. It will be a Western country, but the West itself is not that united. So it all depends where Mr. Biden and company will come, and they will probably attract Canada back to the American order. About this emerging order, yeah, a lot of it is speculation. The emerging order is going to depend on who will be economically down massively or not, how long this crisis will continue. Whether we get the 1920s sort of mode, I don't think so, because leadership is there up to a point, and technological innovations are happening. So if one sector of the economy goes down, the other sector can pick up some sense. That's what is happening in the stock market today. The economic, I mean, the technology companies are doing very well. So we will see a lot of dislocations, relocations, strategizing, very important, how to attract businesses and how to become human resource as an attractive element. And that's where I would put a lot of emphasis as if India is concerned. The geopolitical, geostrategic opportunities come and go. And if we don't make use of them, then eventually you can be a victim of others' choices. So overall, I'm not that pessimistic. I don't see there's a new article in Foreign Affairs comparing this emerging era to 1920s and 30s. I don't think direct war and other things are feasible, as well as unless some stupid leaders decide to start something. Of course, a lot of things that can happen, but nobody predicted this COVID pandemic the way it is spreading. There were predictions, but always by fringe groups. So I don't know, but the comparisons are overstretched, and that whether the United States will have the power to start a war and win, no. Deterrence, yes. I think deterrence should be given more attention. And also the fact that relationships are important. And then strategic planning, calculated planning on how to face different scenarios. Not necessarily all of them are based on frontal warfare or direct conquest. Many of them will be based on indirect, limited probes, as we are witnessing today. And how to not to get too excited and start a war to respond in response to that. So you need to think of, if I'm a planner in India, what limited probes one can have to counter the Chinese, what kind of economic strategy, trade strategy to counter China in Africa, where, for instance, India has a traditional link, to retain your relationship with your South Asian smaller states, and to pacify Pakistan up to a point, to prevent there is a big alliance between the two, China, Pakistan. But the buildup of the infrastructure on the border is definitely overdue. Smart planning is needed, technological advancements. Indian Army has to become a 21st century army and navy, etc. And focus a lot on human development. That is dragging India down still. You can't understand how much we are losing status, wealth, power because of the lack of human development and missing that demographic dividend that we talk about. So I see India as not going to go down as it was in the past in terms of its capacities, but the Indian elite has to become strategic at every level of decision making and to have a national plan, not just Delhi based, to make it a global power of the 21st century, and it is feasible. I don't know what else I can say. Thank you so much for patience in listening to my random ideas. But if you want more ideas, it's better to read my stuff, which I have everywhere on my various venues. So is that enough, Lawrence? Thank you so much.
Thank you, TV, for the wonderful time, and I really thank you for the patience in answering these questions, and to all our participants who asked questions and who participated, our sincere thanks and much appreciation. Thank you. Good night. God bless.
Thank you so much, sir, for being here, and thank you all for being here also. To know more about our work we do, check out our website, www.cppr.in. CPPR is also active on Facebook, Twitter, Telegram, and LinkedIn. We use the Twitter handle CPPR India. You can catch the live updates of today's talk as well as the photos on #CPPR Talks.